where we've got to, at the moment, and we're recording now. So the context for this is social care services for people with a learning disability whose behaviours can challenge. Now, we know that challenging behaviour can lead to negative outcomes for the person who displays it. So restrictive practices, exclusion, sometimes it can be a barrier to someone just enjoying a good quality of life. But we know that it can also lead to negative outcomes for staff in the form of stress and sometimes trauma. So why is it important to address that? The answer to that might seem obvious. And first and foremost, it's important because it's the right thing to do ethically. Also worth adding that employers have a legal responsibility to look after the well-being of their staff. But it's worth delving into this a little bit, because for a lot of the people to whom this would be applicable, so the people who receive PBS services, who get some kind of behaviour support, they're often people with a learning disability who rely on direct care staff to facilitate their engagement in all of the activities of daily living. So if staff are feeling stressed and traumatized, it's highly likely that's going to impact on the quality of the support they provide. And then, of course, you get a vicious circle. Poor support increases the likelihood of challenging behavior, which in turn increases the likelihood of stressed, traumatized staff. You have to forgive me. My routine is 2 coffees every morning, regardless of what I'm doing. So this is number 2.
Fair enough.
So we know that challenging behaviour can impact on staff well-being. So, and just so there's no confusion, I'm talking about staff providing direct support who can directly experience incidents of challenging behaviour. But what's interesting is it's not a straightforward linear relationship. So it's not the case that this incident of severe challenging behaviour will automatically lead to stress and burnout in staff. It's interesting in that some recent research is providing evidence that the working environment has a part to play here. Okay? And I'll share with you a little bit of that research. So Skirrow and Hatton back in 2006, so actually it's not that recent anymore, but they found that burnout was more likely if staff didn't like the organisation and didn't feel supported or appreciated. They believed that they gave more than they got back. A few other researchers, amongst them Peter Baker, who's heading up this research, found, and this I think is incredibly important and interesting, that the staff members' relationship with their peers, their colleagues, and the organisation can exert an even more powerful influence on their well-being than service user characteristics like challenging behaviour. Okay? So if that's true, as certainly some evidence suggests, then what can organisations do about it? Well, one of the things that's happening in some sectors, not in ours, and I'll explain that, is that organisations are using something called the Critical Incident Stress Management approach, or CISM for short. So it's a peer-led approach. So it's not an external person coming in to run the session. Its goal is to address incidents experienced by people in the workplace. Now, its goal is not to treat conditions like PTSD. So I've used the word trauma a lot and stress, and I'm talking about occupational trauma, occupational stress, really. So it's not to treat, but it's to provide social organizational support in the hope of preventing stress building up. Okay. Now, it's used widely in emergency services, so police, firefighters, paramedics, very underused in our sector, which is what we're looking to change with the STRAW project. So that's a little bit of background and rationale. What we're trying to do is adapt CISM, which is predominantly used in emergency services, for use in social care, in particular for staff supporting people whose behaviours can challenge. Okay? So I thought that the best way to explain how this might work would be to sort of take you through the steps of the process. So I've done this presentation about 3 times now, and last night I was updating it because we're tweaking things as we go. So this is a slightly different flow chart now, and I'll explain the difference in a minute. If you've never seen this before, that what I just said won't mean anything anyway. But I'll take you through how this would work. So let's say you've got a service, for example, a community service, and there's an incident of challenging behaviour on shift or some other serious incident. Okay, so the answer is yes, an incident occurred. The first step in the CISM approach is to organise a defusing meeting. So this is something that is supposed to happen within 24 hours of the incident, but ideally it happens before people leave their shift. So it's supposed to be very, very responsive following an incident. It's brief in that it lasts about 15 or 20 minutes because it has to be practical. You can't just on the spur of the moment have a 2-hour. I'm so sorry, someone's just knocked on my door with a delivery. Bear with me 1 second. Sorry.
I feel like it's fine. That would happen, wouldn't it? Well, Nick's not here. I'll just remind you folk about the chat function and the question function as well. So if you've got any questions that you'd like me to put to Nick, then feel free to pop them into there. You put them on at any point. We can cover them when we get towards the end of the session.
I'm sorry about that. I got one of those texts saying it will be between 9 and 1. So this is when they deliver it.
Yeah, cool. Go for it. Carry on.
So, where was I? Okay, so brief meeting, 20 minutes. And what's important to stress, again, to reiterate, is that the goal of this is to provide support for colleagues if they've experienced one of these stressful or critical incidents. Brief note to self, don't run up the stairs when you're in the middle of a presentation. I just need to catch my breath. So in terms of what this might look like, it starts off with the facilitator. Now, these are trained facilitators, and when I get into the methodology for this, I'll explain that in a bit more depth, but they invite people to talk about what happened. So that's just a very factual recounting of the incident. Then they move on to talking about their reactions to it, their thoughts, their feelings. The facilitator talks about common reactions to this type of incident. So what they're trying to do there is to normalize what happened. Yeah, what you're feeling is normal. And it ends with a discussion on some fairly simple supports that people can access. So as simple as, is there someone at home you can talk to when you leave your shift? can you access, personal support networks if necessary? Okay? And I wanted to share with you, I was discussing this with Peter Baker, and he was saying that there are a few organizations that he's done a little bit of work with using this approach, and he got some really interesting feedback from one. They said that with regard to the second point on the slide here, the goal is to provide support, not to try to learn from the incident. So it's not that sort of typical learning, organizational learning debrief that most of us in this field will be familiar with. And the people who had experienced an incident and had attended one of these diffusing meetings, their feedback was being told that meant everything to them. So knowing that the meeting was just about giving them the support they need, not having to dissect the incident, figure out what could have been done differently, made all of the difference. So it's just something I wanted to share with you there. I think that's and certainly something that we took on board as a research team. Now, the diffusing meeting is also an opportunity to identify whether there is a need for a more comprehensive follow-up meeting, something called a critical incident stress debrief. Okay, and I will come on to that as we run through that flow chart. So there's been an incident. We've had the diffusing meeting. The next question to ask is, are there any red flags? Are there any indicators that maybe we're going to need that more comprehensive debrief a little bit further down the line? So we spent a bit of time as a research team looking at this and trying to think of the types of incidents that might be deemed moderate versus those that might be high in terms of impact, severity, and severe. And so we ended up coming up with a table. There's much more to it. This is just a little sample from that. In the second column, we've got the type of incident. So I think about this as a kind of the objective part of these set of criteria. So in moderate, for example, we've got the behavior was not directed at staff. So maybe we're looking at property damage there. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, severe, we've got an incident that required a staff member to go to hospital, okay, or maybe the attack involved a weapon. So that's the kind of, if you think of it behaviorally, this is the sort of observable part of that. But then you've got the staff perception column. So in here, we've got things like in moderate, staff understand the behavior. They were calm and in control. They supported each other. Go to the last one, they felt powerless. They felt very guilty because someone else maybe stepped in and got hurt. There's an interesting criterion in the second row there under staff perception, not listened to. So they told the organization that staffing levels weren't enough. The organization did nothing and they got hurt. Given the earlier research that I mentioned, there is evidence that people who don't feel supported by the organization are more likely to feel stressed and potentially traumatized. So this was an interesting exercise, and something else to share with you on this. And I think what the story I'm about to tell, for me, it highlights the importance of giving maybe more weighting to staff's perception of an incident than its more objective description. So a member of the research team, the member of the research team who has the most experience with CISM, with this approach, told us a story. He works a lot with emergency services, providing this training for them. And he gave the example of a firefighter. So as you probably know, the fire service often gets called out to road traffic accidents. And so you've got a firefighter who sees these horrible things, you know, year in, year out, and seems to be coping pretty well. And then this firefighter starts a family. So now he has, let's say, a 1-year-old child. He goes out to a traffic accident, and it involved a 1 or 2-year-old child. And because of what's going on, it just floors him. And he has quite a significant reaction to that. So I think regardless of what the incident looks like, it's a guide. You know, it's a guide for a facilitator to say, okay, I think people might need a bit of follow-up. I might need to check in on this. I think what's quite key here is how people feel about the incident. So I think it was Ellis, a famous cognitive psychologist, I think, who said there's an event and then there's people's perception of that event. I think that's my takeaway from that. So back to our flow chart. There's been an incident. We've had a diffusing meeting. Let's say there were red flags present. So yes, we do need to now move to having our more comprehensive meeting. So that the second type of debriefing meeting is called the critical incident stress debrief. And we called it that. We were thinking, what do we call this? Because originally it was called debrief, but again, we wanted to distinguish this from the organizational debrief, where you learn from the incident. So this takes a bit longer. This can be a couple of hours. It's typically held between 3 days and 2 weeks after the incident. The goals are very similar to the goals of the diffusing meeting. So it's still to acknowledge the impact of the incident and provide peer support, okay? But there are a few differences here, and this meeting, really, to some extent, the diffusing meeting is based on a similar model, but this is where it comes from. And although we may tweak this slightly, I think it's pretty much going to follow this pattern. So as with the diffusing meeting, you have the introduction, which is key. If you remember that bit of feedback I gave you that Peter Baker had, how much the attendees valued the facilitator saying, this is about supporting you, not learning from the incident. So that's part of the introduction. The facts, that's where the people attending talk again about what happened. They share, if they can remember, what their immediate reactions were to the incident. But now, because we've had a few weeks, they can talk about reactions that occurred a bit later. And that's where this differs in a small but important way, in that it's a possibly a better gauge of how well people are coping in the days and few weeks that followed. Because what we would hope is that you know, people are feeling better, but if they're not, then we need to pick up on that. So the facilitator will still talk about common reactions to these types of incidents. So that's the normalizing step there. And they'll still talk about what people can do to feel better. And that can be those informal approaches that I mentioned before. So people trying to make use of their own social networks. So really everything we know from the evidence that helps with stress, you know, getting together with people, exercise, meditation, we might start talking about those types of strategies. Now, if it's needed, this is the point at which we might refer someone for a psychological assessment, and potentially, depending on the outcome of the assessment, specific therapy. So it's here we might be referring on for specific interventions, because remember, what we're doing here is not treatment. This is about prevention. Okay? So that could be further help. It could be agreeing to get back together again in 6 weeks just to check on how people are doing. Okay, so I said I'd talk about our methodology for the actual study. So in many ways, it's a feasibility study, the STRAW project, because we're trying to answer the question, is it feasible to have a CISM approach in social care, given it's not really been done, you know, with just a few exceptions. So that's really what this is about. We will be gathering some outcome data, which I'll say a bit more about, and actually we've done, the adaptation is done. So now we're just up to the point we're about to pilot this. So I'll tell you a little bit about the pilot. We're implementing this approach with 2 services, and they're each in a different social care provider. The managers or the practice leaders in those services will be taught the adapted CISM approach, but it's going to, you know, very similar to what I've run through there. It's a 2-day course, so day 1 is on diffusing, how to facilitate that diffusing meeting, and we're expecting to train more people for that, because the thinking is more people in when it's actually implemented, it will require a diffusing meeting, and less will require the more comprehensive follow-up. Okay? Day 2 is about the more comprehensive follow-up. So that's the critical incident stress debrief. After that, services will go ahead and implement the model. So the criteria for being included was that they support people whose behaviours challenge and the incidents are fairly frequent. So what we would be wanting those services to do is, after an incident, basically follow that flow chart. So run the diffusing meeting if red flags are present, organise the critical incident stress debrief. And when all of this happens, this will be about run for about 6 months, excuse me. And over that time, we'll be gathering feasibility data and also outcome data. So to give you an example, the feasibility data, we'll be looking at what's the financial cost of this? Is it affordable? And we have an economist on the research team who will deal with all of that. But also, what will the uptake be? Will people actually make use of the diffusing meeting? Because it's not, you can't make this mandatory. It's something that people have to be offered. So those are the key things we're looking at under the heading of feasibility. With regard to outcome data, one of the measures we'll be using is something called the impact of event scale, revised actually. And this is a questionnaire that is designed to measure one's subjective experience of in relation to a specific traumatic event, okay? And in addition to that, we're still deciding on this point, but we may also make use of the participating organisations' existing sort of recording measures that might be of use. So we might look at absenteeism, staff turnover, for example, taking on board, of course, that 6 months is not a very long time to draw huge conclusions from those kind of data. Okay, but if they're there, we'll make use of them as well. So where are we? Well, we're just about to start gathering baseline data using the measure that I mentioned. The training is all set for early March. And as I've already said, it will be followed by the 6 months of data gathering, after which we'll put all of that together. This will lead to a journal paper, at least one. I'm guessing maybe next year that will be. And depending on the results, because, does it have good outcomes? Is it feasible? we may look to scale this up in future and actually run it as a much bigger study over multiple sites. So but time will tell on that one. So that's all from me.
Cool.
Yeah, it was about half an hour.
Yeah, it was that time, wasn't it?
So any questions? Comments?
Yeah, a few have come up. That was first of all, I suppose my own thoughts. That was really interesting, actually, from my perspective, because we talk quite a lot. I've talked quite a lot about the critical incident stress management debrief, because Peter Baker sort of taught me about that as I was studying, and he presented at the last conference. But it's really interesting to hear the way it's being adapted, and I think that's going to help me going forward to talking about it, just to sort of hear those updates, because I think when I first learned about it, it was that model that was being used in emergency services and those kinds of things. So yeah, nice to sort of see how it's being adapted for social care contexts. So we've got one question, and then we had some discussion in the chat that was going on. So I'll put those to you as well. So I'm not sure what this person's first name is, but they're PCANs from the Kent Autistic Society or Association. Or
Paul. I know Paul. Yes.
Excellent. He's asked, is there the CISM, we're saying CISM, aren't we? CISM. Is it part of the tertiary level of the organisation-wide positive staff support pyramid? So that your tiers, is it at that tertiary level?
That's a good question. It certainly fits with a PBS approach, because it's all about making sure systems support intervention, support people providing interventions, and so on. So it all fits, and I guess tier one is sort of what everyone gets, isn't it? That's how we think of PBS. So I suppose if it's something that you would want, if this is going to work, it's got to be something that organizations are prepared to do in advance, because they have to train people. Some of the research on this is quite interesting in terms of trained, untrained facilitators. Not surprising at all, but it doesn't go well if people are not trained. Peter shares some really quite amusing and disturbing examples of things that facilitators have said and done in response to being told about incidents that are just not helpful at all. So I would think, Paul, that it would be something there, and so that it would fit into the tier that is, this is what everyone gets. So sort of tier one, because although the emphasis in my talk has been on incidents of challenging behaviour, it could potentially be, so it's a bit of a gruesome example, but if someone got knocked down by a car, absolutely, you would have a diffusing meeting. It wouldn't. So I believe, yes, it's something that should be there for everyone. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Paul's just added he meant the Peter Baker staff support pyramid, but I think that's what you were talking about, wasn't it, Nick? The levels of.
I think so, Paul. Yeah, I think that sort of maps on. So I've got in my head the school-wide PBS with, here's what everyone gets, here's what a few get, and here's the sort of top level of more technical analysis and intervention. Is that what you meant, Paul?
I can bring you in, Paul, if it's easier. So
bring him in. Yeah, let's have a chat.
Let me just find him on the list. It's sometimes a bit easier, isn't it, than doing it via. There we go. Talking permitted, it says.
Hi, Nick. You're right.
Hi, Paul.
It was from the initial research that Peter Baker did around staff support and wellbeing, kind of when he was trying to define debriefing. So you had the 3 levels of support: the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. And the tertiary was more the intensive support. So I guess it kind of echoes the PBS pyramid, which is I think what you were describing then, but more the primary level, day-to-day things that staff can do to maintain their own well-being. And then the secondary level was the kind of end of shift stand downs and things like that. I was just wondering, because you talked about the 2 different responses there to incidents, so the CISM and then the debrief if there's red flags. I'm just wondering if the CISM fits into that secondary level or still would be.
So I understand. Thanks for elaborating. So they're both CISM.
Yeah, that would have been too much to write. Thank you for unmuting.
So in answer to your question, they're both CISM. So diffusing and the more comprehensive debrief, they're both CISM as far as I'm aware. And I'm just having a quick check through, because I do remember, if you bear with me I'm in my straw folder now, and I've got the manual here, and I do remember Peter's triangle. So if you give me 2 seconds, here we go.
As well in my head, I've seen the triangle.
The triangle. There are so many triangles in PBS. This is the problem. Let's have a look. So he's got. Here we go. So he does have it as not where I was saying, something that everyone gets. He's got it right at the top here. So just for everyone listening, seeing as I did such a bad job with that answer, I will explain that in a bit more detail. So top of the triangle, you've got intensive supports, tertiary prevention. So he's putting in there the group, he's calling it group debrief and diffusing. So diffusing is the meeting that happens whilst you're still on shift. And the debrief, that's the critical incident stress management debrief. That's in a few weeks. So they're both grouped under intensive support. So not what everyone gets, the more. But he's also got under targeted support. So next one down in the triangle, secondary prevention, an end of shift stand down diffusing, which is kind of the same thing. So I guess he's seeing it as being something that could fit in both, so the bigger, more comprehensive meeting, that's what less people will get, which makes sense. And the end of shift sort of stand down diffusing, because in emergency services, they refer to diffusing as a standing down meeting. So that's kind of what more people will get at that level. And just to sort of round that off, really, the final tier there. So this is what everyone would get if you were implementing this, would be actually what you would do from PBS perspective. So making sure everyone has a plan, making sure people are taught about trauma and stress when they're inducted, and regular supervisions. Okay, so did I answer your question in the end, Paul?
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for that, Nick. A few comments that come up in the chat. So there was some discussion going, sort of started by Lavley, who was talking about or asking, with the red flag, would you take into consideration the level of experience the staff may have in supporting individuals with complex or challenging behaviours? Do you think experienced staff reaction may differ from a new starter?
That's a good question. Who did you say that was from?
Lovely.
Lovely. Hello, Lovely. You know what? I don't think I would. And the reason is, I think that someone's reaction to a critical incident, severe incident, I think is dependent on so many variables. So it could be experience plays a part, It could be having been exposed to it and maybe supported well through it in the past has enabled someone to build up some kind of resilience. But then that same person could have just had something awful happen in their personal life. For example, suffered a bereavement, Now that person who, for years has managed and genuinely been coping very well may really struggle. So I think the answer there, Lavely, would be no, would be the short answer, and the longer answer would be, I think I go back to my paraphrasing of Ellis, the cognitive psychologist, who said there's an event and there's people's perception of that event. So which will be informed by the interaction of so many other variables. Was it a little bit different from an incident that occurred before? You know, did they get hurt this time? Do they have a physical health problem that's flared up? You know, is there something going on in their personal life? And this is why, when I was having to think about this presentation yesterday, and I was looking at that table, actually the red flags table, and I was thinking, you know, you could, even some of the more severe incidents on this, objectively severe, so someone has to go to hospital. I think if I was running the facilitation, this is how I would approach it. If it was that something that most people would think was pretty severe occurred, I would be running the diffusing meeting, checking people's reaction. If everyone seemed pretty okay with it, I would be led by that. So their subjective experience, their reactions would be take precedent for me in terms of determining whether or not to go to the other meeting. But I would be saying to them, you know what, is it okay if I just check in with you in a week and a half, 2 weeks, just to see if anything's changed and maybe you do want that critical incident debrief. Whereas if it was a really objectively mild incident and their experience of it was, it's no big deal, I might just leave it at the diffusing meeting. That's my take on it.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting to see that table where the staff perception side of things is actually factored in, because so often it's not, is it? It's very much it needs to meet this criteria in order to get this level of support, but actually that perception is so important, isn't it, to your experience of that event. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you for that. Deb has asked, so Deb Meerman has asked, what would you recommend the approach would be where there have been multiple incidents within the same time frame? Would you debrief all incidents, or would it be a different meeting for each?
I think it would be, so I guess the standard way in which this is implemented is that if an incident occurs on shift, although on the slide it says within 24 hours, ideally there is a kind of standing down at the end of the shift, so people don't leave with all of that adrenaline and all of that stress. So my view would be that even if there was an incident on Monday, on Tuesday on shift, on Wednesday, that you would have that standing down at the end of the shift. Yeah, that's how I would approach it. Yeah,
cool. That sounds good. Heather O'Brien has asked about where we can access debrief training. I think that's probably something that quite a few people are thinking. We get asked as well, sort of as we're going through this. It's how do we train managers and how to use these approaches? Is there anything you'd recommend?
Well, unfortunately, not at the minute. No, because as I alluded to in the early part of the presentation, it's only really Peter who became really interested in this sort of, I guess about five years plus ago, who's looking to adapt it for use in our field. So, and that's really what this pilot's all about. So we've adapted the training. So I mentioned, I don't think I mentioned his name. It's a guy called Stephen who literally wrote the book on this. Actually, he wrote a book about this approach, and he's the person in the research team who has done the most in terms of the content of the training, because it's a course that he's been rolling out for years in emergency services, and the rest of us who are from a PBS, learning disabilities background, we tweaked a few things, changed some of the language to make it fit with our field. So really, it's only now, or March, that he'll actually be delivering this adapted training for the first time. And then, of course, it's a case of doing the research and publishing the results. So I think it's it's a really long-winded answer. I'm sorry. The short answer is I can't recommend anyone, but I hope that within a year I will be able to.
That's cool. Yeah, it's a field that's growing. It's been, I think, neglected, hasn't it, for so long. Actually, this focus, and sort of organisations have needed to kind of develop their own debrief systems, haven't they? Which very often do focus on the organisational sort of lessons and factors, don't they?
Agreed, Hannah. Yeah, and I think, but I sort of feel like I've not left you with anything there. That the person who just answered that question. I was talking with my partner just yesterday, because I said I've got this presentation today, and she works in neuro rehab. She's a clinical psychologist, and she said, "Oh, we've got a guy that comes in and does something similar, and he is someone who's had some. I think he's had some training in counselling. He's attached to the ward, but not. So it's not exactly the same. It's not sort of peer support exactly, but." She said, when I was talking about how the diffusing and debriefing meetings work, she said, "Oh, that's kind of similar, because he gets us all together and he says sort of what happened, and we tell him about something that happened with a patient, and then he says, and how do you feel, and then how do other people feel?" And it really sounded similar to what we're talking about doing here. I think maybe the main, I'm not sure how quickly this person gets to the ward, so it might be a few days after something happens. So what we're recommending here is that it happens sort of there and then, which is why, just from a practical perspective, you need peers trained up. You need people who actually can do it, at short notice. So I guess in answer to that question, if there are people who've got some training in how to do that, because it doesn't go well if people aren't trained, and who can just, avoid the sort of, let's separate that from the let's learn from the incident debrief, then, potentially there could be some value in that sort of approach, if people know what they're doing, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, that's as good an answer as you can give. Being
at the minute,
an evolving area, isn't it? And just sort of building on that point, Maureen. So I'm working through the chat sort of chronologically. There's quite a lot there at the moment, but Maureen Prescott has pointed out the fact that her organisation are really working on this currently. They're building on their debrief sort of format. They want to promote the principles of the Straw Project, but they wanted to know how they could do that without training. And I guess the answer is to read the papers, to build up their knowledge, and the principles can still be incorporated, can't they?
Yeah, I think so. And I know I mentioned earlier that Peter has done bits of work using these approaches with a few organisations, and so some people have benefited from a little bit of consultation on that I guess. So what I can do is check with him, check with the research team on whether there's anything existing that we can direct people to. I mean, people are welcome to read Stephen's book. It's Stephen Regal. Let me double check. It's Stephen Regal. I'll double check that as we're going through, just to make sure. I've got a terrible memory for names, so I'll double check. I'll go into one of our meeting minutes, make sure I've got his name down correctly. But people are welcome to read his work. Although what I would say is that we have made a few adaptations to the training so that it does fit with our particular field.
That's cool. Yeah, I think someone later down had asked for the name of the author in the book, so
I'll double check. Yeah, I'll double check. I'm pretty sure. I did get it slightly wrong. It's Stephen, PH spelling, and it's Regel, REGEL.
Mm-hmm.
So his books, I'm pretty sure his books are on Amazon.
Wonderful, thank you. Jack Griffiths. So I agree with the point made about individual trauma impacting on the provision of this model by managers and or peers. I wondered what your thoughts are, Nick, around the expectations between objective versus subjective nature of support in the context of delivering the model. Objective versus subjective nature of support. Is it all right to open that person's mic so they can elaborate on that? Is that okay, Jack?
You don't mind, Jack?
Let me just find you on the participant list a minute. There we go.
Hi, sorry, I think you've already answered my question when you were talking about it earlier. But yeah, I was just wondering in terms of, I suppose it's really hard to say, isn't it? Because I suppose every incident would be different from one another. So I suppose it would depend, wouldn't it, on like what level of support that individual would require. So I was more so just wondering around like, what support how do you sort of remain objective whilst tailoring it to a specific incident? But I suppose that might be really, really hard to answer.
Yeah, it's a good question. So were you thinking, Jack, of so let's say we've got 3 staff members who are involved in the incident and what each of them might need in terms of support to feel better about it after?
Yes.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Okay. So it would be very, very individual. So that part of the meeting is talking about and as informal as, is there someone at home when you leave the shift? You know, is there someone you can go and talk to, because you know someone might just be heading off to you know, an empty house or something, and you know, left to kind of go through all of what's happened, and sometimes it is probably all of experience at some point. If something happens that throws you a little bit, you know, our brains might not work as well as normal, and things that might seem obvious when we're calm might be less obvious. So actually, someone saying, "Okay, let's figure out what you can do," and it then becomes quite simple. Oh, you know, I can call a friend. We can go to the pub, you know. And just saying, right, well, when you go home, make sure you do that, you know, agreeing it like that. So it always starting with what works for you, what would be good for you, so individual. But there's nothing wrong. I think it's possibly something that would happen more at the second, more comprehensive meeting. But there are general evidence-based strategies for helping with stress, like exercise, like getting together with your social circle, and for some meditation, but you know, it's not for everyone. So it's okay to be recommending things like that as well, because it's quite generic, as long as what we're not doing is trying to treat a problem. It really is, this model is about preventing people from becoming traumatized in the first place.
Well, yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we'll do one more, should we, Nick, and then we'll sort of draw things up shortly, so we can send people off to other talks and time for comfort breaks and things like that. But where did I get to? I think you might have sort of answered this question in one of your other questions, but it was a talk about the terminology that's used, that term standing down. Will that be absorbed in our sector, or will that be changed?
We're going with diffusing. We're going with diffusing at the minute. So I suspect that unless people start, you know, coming up with different terms, which you know they're welcome to in their own organisations, it would probably be sticking with diffusing. And actually, there's one thing I just realised I forgot to mention. I said that we'd adapted the flow chart, and I forgot to say what the adaptation was. So when we've been talking about this, so when I presented on it, when Peter's presented on it, people have said, well, what about the organizational debrief, the learning from the incident? Where does that happen? So on the flow chart, we had the diffusing, and then we had kind of after that. So between the diffusing and the bigger critical incident stress debrief, there would be some kind of discussion about, you know, what can we learn from the incident if that was deemed necessary. So we're not saying there's anything wrong with that. In fact, that's, you know, that can be useful in terms of refining our strategies and our reactive strategies, but it's got to be, you can't do both with these meetings. Yeah, they have to have very different purposes. And what we're talking about here is just supporting the people who were involved in the incident.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more, I'm just going to ask one more that's come up. That's because I'm interested in the answer. But what's your experience or opinion on social care staff not engaging with diffusing in briefing meetings? Just
well, this is what, yeah, exactly. It's a really good question, because, and that's one of the key measures that we're looking at in terms of the feasibility aspects of this. So we've got, you know, is it feasible? Does it work? Yeah. And that, you know, feasibility, really, we're looking at, will people actually agree to go to the meetings, and will it be too costly, as in, you know, financial cost to organizations? So the feedback I've had from different organizations is that it's mixed. And again, I think it's a bit like my answer to Lavely's question about, you know, what are the determinants of how severe a reaction might be. I think it's very similar. So if you've got staff in an organization where, you know, things aren't going well, they don't feel supported, and then someone says, you know, you've been in an incident, come and have a chat with me, and the person they're going to have a chat with is the one they don't feel supported by, you know, I think it's likely you could get quite poor uptake. So I think it's going to be, you know, again, something that depends on a bunch of variables, but chief amongst them, the existing relationship between, well, often the manager and their frontline staff. And I've seen this so many times. We've got a manager in the intervention group for this. So there's a research team and there's an intervention group. And she, I worked with her before, and she's a brilliant manager. And there were severe incidents of challenging behavior occurring frequently, and yet no staff left because she was there with them, supporting them. There was that kind of trust. So if she arranged a diffusing meeting, everyone would attend. Another manager who was quite inexperienced, this is all happening around the same time, didn't really know how to support the team. Incidents of challenging behavior, far less severe by anyone's measure. And yet within a month, I think a third of the team had left. So I hope that goes some way towards, you know, answering your question on that.
Yeah, it's about, supporting staff to feel engaged in that process, and they want to be part of it, isn't it, at the end of the day? Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to have to draw you to a close, Nick. So apologies if there's anyone that we didn't get to the questions of. There were lots of really interesting discussion and quite loads of questions, so that's great. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you folks, or at least in name form, in some of the other talks later on in the day. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.